is it true that if a lot of people die in the same place at the same time, it must be contagious, right? That's kind of the philosophy. And I would say, first of all, that's ridiculous unless one thinks Hiroshima was a virus. A lot of people died in the same place, same thing, and there's not a virus. Everybody knows it was from a nuclear explosion. And so the next thing is, well, what about if it spreads? Starts in one place and starts spreading all over the world or all over the region or something. Again, we have an example of Chernobyl, which was a nuclear accident, which made a lot of people sick initially and then started spreading all over Eastern and eventually Western Europe, and people got sick in a similar way. And again, I don't think anybody thinks that's a virus. And so then you get into even a more sophisticated thing. Well, if a bunch of people exhibit the same phenomena and there's nothing else you can point to, there's no nuclear bomb, there's no explosion, there's no nothing, and they have the same sort of physiological response or symptoms, that must mean it's contagious. And I would only point out that if you take the example of you put 10 women, 20-year-old women, and you send them to a dormitory or a cabin and you have them live for 6 to 12 months, they all start menstruating at around the same time. And nobody thinks that's contagious. And nobody can find any reason why that happens. And I can give you the exact reason I think it happens. But so we have to be careful with jumping to conclusions that because it's either a bunch of people or because it's spreading or because we don't know the cause. And interestingly, one of the definitions for proving viral causation now is if a bunch of people get sick and you can't figure out another reason, then it must be a virus, which I would think actually submit as absurd. So then you get into the question of what's happening to all these people. Because just to be clear, I didn't say that people aren't sick, right? And I didn't say that people aren't dying. And it's hard to know how many exactly, because since there's no test, we don't know how many cases there are. And there's no way to know that somebody, quote, died of coronavirus or COVID if they died of a heart attack and have a positive test. So we have all these caveats of we don't know how many people are dying or et cetera. But let's just say there is something that's killing a bunch of people now that's new. So let's just start from there. Now, the first thing one does or should do is say, so what are they dying of? And from every report you read, they're dying of two very specific things. One is they look like they have a hyperinflammatory response, particularly in their lungs, but in many other tissues. Sometimes their heart, sometimes their blood vessels. They're finding it sometimes in their kidneys, etc. So there's an excessive inflammatory response. So that's the first thing. The second thing, and there have been a number of ER doctors and a number of reports and a number of confirmation, they're dying of hypoxia, which means low oxygen. And they've even been able to show that if you put somebody with hypoxia and inflammation in their lungs on a ventilator, you can often kill them because that's not an appropriate treatment. So they're sort of blowing the whistle. They don't understand how the coronavirus could cause hypoxia. There's very little evidence that this is any kind of sort of pneumonia. They don't have elevated white count. They don't have all the classic symptoms that we would associate with pneumonia. So that's not the case. So how do you explain a hyperinflammatory response and hypoxia? I mean, it's very simple, and this is what I said in the beginning. It's very simple and easy to make somebody have a hyperinflammatory response. All you have to do is expose them to aluminum, because aluminum is what we put in vaccines to create an inflammatory response. And, you know, believe it or not, that the government says we're spraying aluminum dust in the air to help with so-called geoengineering. That's not a theory. That's the sort of documents by the government, and their explanation is we're trying to shield the earth or create weather changes or whatever it is they're trying to do. And so you have particularly in places like Wuhan and northern Italy and Spain and New York City, you have a hyper-immunized population, particularly with aluminum-containing vaccines. You have aluminum sprayed in the air, which then gets in your lungs and creates an inflammatory response, as well as glyphosate and general air pollution and cyanide, and there's lots of other things. There's a whole lot of actual toxins that would create the body's response. Now, a lot of doctors, and especially I would say alternative doctors, have, in my opinion, made the mistake of saying inflammation is the root cause of illness. To me, that's nonsense. Inflammation is what your body uses to try to flush toxins out of the tissue. It's the story that I've told a million times. You get a splinter in your finger, you don't take it out, you get pus, that's an inflammatory response. The purpose of it is to get the splinter out. The splinter is the illness, the inflammation is the therapy. You put debris called cigarette smoke in your lungs, you make an inflammatory response, you have a cough and a fever and all the rest. The inflammatory response is the therapy for smoking. And if you make the mistake of not seeing it like that, you stop the therapy, then the cigarette smoke builds up. 20 years later, you have lung cancer, and you say, I don't know why you got lung cancer, you shouldn't have smoked. But it's two things. A, you smoked, and B, somebody stopped you from getting it out of your lungs. When you put those together, that's a recipe for chronic disease. So the inflammatory response is not the illness, it's provoked, excessively by the ingestion or the breathing in or the injection of aluminum. But it's also a normal response to there's poisons and toxins in the air, and your body's trying to get rid of it. So that's the one side. The other side, and why this is a new phenomena in my opinion, and there's a lot of evidence to show this, is that dating back to 1977, the Naval Intelligence Service did studies on the effect of millimeter waves on animal and human physiology, and they clearly showed that millimeter waves, which is otherwise known as 5G, and just because it's not certain ones, what happens is these electromagnetic frequencies function through harmonics and frequency generation. And what they do is they biodegrade the oxygen in the air. So essentially, they lower the concentration of available oxygen, and they have a specific toxic effect on the ability of your mitochondria to use the oxygen that you do have available to make it into something called ATP, which is not energy as we think, but it helps structure the water in your tissues. And the net result of that is you have a new phenomena of hypoxia which has never been seen before. The other thing that does is this new electromagnetic frequency also degrades the DNA. So you have a so-called novel piece of genetic material which we're erroneously calling a coronavirus. And so that is being picked up on the tests. So the people who are poisoned in this way, to a certain extent will tend to test positive, just because if you poison somebody with arsenic, you get a certain kind of genetic degradation. If you poison them with mercury, you get a different kind. If you poison them with a combination of 5G and aluminum, you get this kind, and the test is for this kind. And all this nonsense about that virus is genetic, is mutating, and they have different forms of it all over the world, that's just make-believe. What's happening is one place may be 5G and glyphosate. Another place may be biodiesel fuel, which has glyphosate. So there's all these variations. It's why you see all these different symptoms. And all this hokum you hear about, oh, it's such a confusing illness. Why are one person have a heart attack and the other has lungs and the other is neurological problem? It's because they're exposed to different toxins and they have a different manifestation. There is nothing very complicated about this. But the new kid on the block is these new electromagnetic frequencies which destructure your water. They break down the genetic material, so you then excrete them as viruses. They get rid of the oxygen. They itself provoke an inflammatory response as long as the other. And there you have a perfectly coherent explanation of why this whole thing is happening. And the thing that I fear the most is that the two main things that have carried on without any break since this whole thing started is the putting up of 5G towers all over the place and the launching of 5G satellites in the ionosphere so that the entire world will be blanketed around September with these frequencies. And that's exactly what they're saying. We will have a new second wave. And that's just eerie to me, because it seems like I'm not the only one who might know about this.